Bruce Lee lost. Not almost lost. Not barely escaped. Not survived by doing something extraordinary in the final second. Lost. He was 28 years old. He weighed 140 pounds. He was the most complete martial artist alive in 1969. He had spent 14 years training every system, every angle, every variable of physical confrontation he could find. And on a Tuesday morning in September 1969, in a private gym in Encino, California, a 53-year-old woman who weighed 138 pounds pinned Bruce Lee to a mat. Her name was Mildred Burke. Her record against men before that morning was 199 wins and 1 loss. By the time Bruce Lee walked out of that gym, her record was 200 wins and 1 loss. When it was over, Bruce Lee did not argue. He did not explain. He did not walk to the corner and find a reason. He bowed, and he said 7 words, "You are stronger than most men I've fought." Then he drove back to Bel Air, sat in his car outside his house for 11 minutes, and wrote something in his notebook that changed what he taught for the rest of his life. This is the full story. Mildred Burke, 53 years old, 5 feet 2 inches, 138 pounds, 3-time Women's World Wrestling Champion. NWA Women's World Championship held for nearly 20 consecutive years, the longest reign in the history of that title. Active career, 1935 to 1955. 20 years of professional competition without a single year off. Her record against men, 199 wins, 1 loss. The format was this. At carnivals and promoter events across America throughout the 1930s and 1940s, a challenge was posted. Any man could step forward. If he could pin Mildred Burke or make her submit within 15 minutes, he won a cash prize. If he could not, Burke kept the money and moved to the next town. 199 men stepped forward. 198 of them left without the prize. The one man who beat her, she never named him publicly. She spoke about him only once, in a 1978 interview, and she said this, "I wrestled almost 200 men. The only time I was defeated, it wasn't because I was weak, it was because I met someone who understood something I hadn't seen before. I spent the next 3 years making sure I understood it too." She never lost again after that. By 1969, Mildred Burke had been retired from active competition for 14 years. She was running a women's wrestling school out of a private facility in Encino, California. She trained students every morning. She was on the mat herself every morning. Her body had not stopped. Only her competition schedule had. The women she trained described her grip as something that did not feel like a human hand. It felt, one student said in a 1971 interview, like a thing that closes and does not open until it decides to. She was 53 years old when Bruce Lee called her school. In September 1969, Bruce Lee was the most studied martial artist in Los Angeles and possibly in the United States. He was 28. He weighed 140 pounds. He operated the Junfan Gung Fu Institute at 628 College Street in Chinatown, Los Angeles. He lived with his wife Linda and their son Brandon at 2551 Roscommar Road in Bel Air. He had been training continuously since the age of 13. He had studied Wing Chun under Grandmaster IP Man in Hong Kong. He had developed Jeet Kune Do, his own fighting philosophy, by absorbing, testing and discarding every system he encountered until only what worked remained. He was obsessive about one thing above everything else, finding the variables he had not yet solved. In 1969, Bruce Lee had one open variable, the ground. His striking was beyond dispute. His speed, hand to target, in 0.05 seconds. His 1-inch punch, 350 pounds of force from a gap of 1 inch. His kicking, a side kick that had been measured at the equivalent force of a 400-pound impact. These were documented, tested, witnessed. On the ground, he was competent. He had trained with Gene LeBell, nicknamed Judo Gene, the godfather of grappling, and absorbed 33 grappling techniques into his Jeet Kune Do curriculum. He understood submissions. He understood takedown defense. He understood ground positioning in theory. But he had never been fully tested on the ground by a specialist. His training journals from this period, documented by Linda Lee after his death, show a pattern that repeats across the pages of late 1969. The same phrase appears in different forms across multiple entries. "The ground has rules I have not yet learned." He did not know where to find someone who could teach him those rules. Then a contact connected to the Los Angeles martial arts community mentioned a name, Mildred Burke, Encino, still teaching, still on the mat every morning. Bruce Lee called her school on a Monday afternoon. Her assistant Ray, who had managed her scheduling since the early 1960s, answered. Bruce Lee identified himself. Ray later described the call in a private account shared with a wrestling historian in 1984. He was very polite, very direct. He said he had heard about Mrs. Burke's work on the ground. He said he believed he had a weakness, and he wanted to understand it. He asked if she would be willing to work with him. I put him on hold and asked her. She said yes. She said come Tuesday. Bruce Lee arrived at 9 a.m. the following morning. The facility in Encino was not what you imagine when you picture a world champion's training space. No trophies in the entrance, no photographs on the walls, no visible record of the 199 men or the 20 years or the sold-out arenas in Tokyo and Chicago and New York. Just mats on the floor, a single overhead light, the smell of canvas that had absorbed 30 years of the specific kind of work that does not photograph well, but produces results that do not lie. Ray was there when Bruce arrived. One female student, a young woman named Denise, who had been training with Burke for 8 months, was instructed to observe from the edge of the room and not speak. Mildred Burke was already on the mat when Bruce Lee walked in, not waiting, working, moving through a ground sequence with the focused economy of someone for whom movement has been stripped of everything unnecessary over 3 decades until only the essential mechanics remain. She did not look up when the door opened. Bruce Lee removed his shoes at the door. He bowed before entering, a gesture so automatic that he performed it without calculation, the way a musician tunes an instrument before playing regardless of the setting. Ray later described that moment. I had worked with Mrs. Burke for many years. I had seen hundreds of people come through that door. Nobody had ever bowed at the entrance before. Mrs. Burke noticed. She didn't say anything, but she noticed. Bruce Lee warmed up alone in the corner of the room for 10 minutes. He did not watch Burke during his warm-up. He had already studied what he needed to study about her movement, from the description Jean Lebel had given him 3 weeks earlier. Lebel's description had been precise. Her base is the lowest I have ever seen in a person her size. She drops to a position where the geometry of her body makes conventional leverage almost useless. You have to think differently when you face it. Most people don't know how to think differently fast enough. Bruce Lee had spent the 3 weeks since that conversation thinking about what differently meant. At 9:14 a.m., Mildred Burke stood from the mat, looked at Bruce Lee across the room, and said 4 words. Ready? We start standing. Bruce Lee said, yes. That was the entire negotiation. No striking, ground only from the first takedown, submission or pin wins. No time limit discussed. They would go until one of them decided to stop. No audience scoring, no prize, no record being kept in any official capacity. Ray had a notepad. He wrote down the start time. He wrote nothing else during what followed, because he later said he forgot he was holding the notepad. The rules were simple because Mildred Burke had been doing this for 34 years, and simple rules were the only kind worth having. Complexity in rules meant complexity in thinking. Complexity in thinking meant delay, and delay, on the ground, is the thing that gets you pinned. Bruce Lee understood this. His entire philosophy was built on the removal of delay, the elimination of the gap between thought and action, until thought and action became the same event. What he did not yet understand, what the next 4 minutes would teach him, was that Mildred Burke had spent 34 years removing something more fundamental than delay. She had removed the assumption that bigger meant harder to move. They began standing, as she said they would. Bruce Lee's stand-up was not the issue. Both of them understood this. The question was not whether Bruce Lee could be taken down. He could prevent most takedowns from most opponents. The question was what happened after. What happened after was this. Mildred Burke did not attempt to take Bruce Lee down in the conventional sense. She moved to his left side, dropped her center of gravity to a position that placed her hips approximately 18 inches from the floor, and waited. Not passively, actively, in the specific way that a structure waits, loaded, stable, prepared to absorb and redirect whatever arrives. Bruce Lee had seen this position described. He had not seen it in person. The description and the reality were different in one specific way that mattered enormously. In the description, the position looked defensive. In person, it was not defensive at all. It was a trap. Minute 1. Bruce Lee attempted his 3 best prepared responses to a low base ground position. The first was a lateral weight shift designed to break structure through the hip. The second was a pressure application to the upper back, designed to compress the base from above. The third was a leg sweep targeting the outside ankle, the standard counter to any low base position in the systems he had studied. All three were absorbed, not blocked, absorbed, the way a body of water absorbs a stone. The stone goes in, the water closes around it, nothing changes. Burke had been absorbing these exact approaches since 1935. She had seen the hip shift from a 280-pound longshoreman in 1938. She had seen the upper back compression from a 240-pound wrestler in 1941. She had seen the ankle sweep from 11 different men in 11 different cities across 12 years of carnival matches. Her body did not decide how to respond to them. It had already decided 34 years ago. At the end of minute 1, Bruce Lee had not advanced. Mildred Burke had not moved. Minute 2, Bruce Lee stopped using prepared responses. This was the correct decision, and he made it faster than any of the 199 men before him had made it. Most of those men had spent their entire time against Burke, repeating the same prepared approaches with increasing force, as though the problem was effort rather than understanding. Bruce Lee recognized the error inside 60 seconds and abandoned the prepared approaches completely. He began improvising. This is where Jeet Kune Do functions at its highest level, in the space after preparation ends and genuine adaptation begins. Bruce Lee's improvised approaches were not random, they were systematic. He was reading Burke's structure the way a reader reads text, looking for the pattern, the repetition, the place where the system reveals its architecture. He found something in the second minute, her left hip. There was a specific angle, approximately 34 degrees off her center line, pressure applied through a diagonal rather than a straight line, where her base position produced a micro shift, not a collapse, not a break, a movement of approximately 2 inches. He tried it. The 2-inch movement happened. He tried it from a slightly different angle. The movement was 1 inch, smaller, not larger. He tried it from the original angle again. The movement was 1/2 inch. She had already adjusted. She had felt him find the angle. She had felt him try it twice. By the third attempt, she had restructured her base position by shifting 3 pounds of pressure from her left knee to her right heel, an adjustment invisible from the outside, automatic from the inside, the product of a nervous system that had been calibrated against exactly this kind of systematic probing for 3 decades. Bruce Lee was not adapting faster than she was. At the end of minute 2, Mildred Burke had the initiative. Minute 3, she moved, not in response to something Bruce did. She chose the moment herself. She shifted from her base position to an offensive configuration in 0.3 seconds, a speed that her body had drilled so deeply that it required no conscious initiation, and she was behind Bruce Lee's left shoulder before his nervous system completed its report on what had changed. Her right arm came across his chest. Her left hand found his left wrist. Her center of gravity dropped another 4 inches, and she became, for the purposes of physics, immovable. Bruce Lee felt the position close around him. He tried 4 things in the next 30 seconds. 2 were correct applications of the leverage principles he had learnt from Jean Labelle. 1 was an improvisation that nearly worked. He later marked it in his notebook as the closest he came. 1 was something he had never tried before, and would never try again because it created a worse position than the one he was trying to escape. At the end of the 3rd minute, Mildred Burke's right knee was on the mat. Bruce Lee's left shoulder was on the mat. His right shoulder followed 4 seconds later, pinned, not by force, by geometry. By 34 years of a single woman refining the same understanding until it functioned with the precision of a physical law rather than a technique. Bruce Lee was pinned by a 53-year-old woman who weighed 138 pounds. The match was over. The room was quiet. Denise, watching from the edge of the mat, did not move. Ray had put down his notepad at some point in minute 2 and had not picked it up again. Mildred Burke released the pin and sat back on her heels. She was breathing steadily, not heavily, steadily, the breath of someone who has worked, not someone who has struggled. Bruce Lee lay still for 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. Then he sat up. He looked at the mat in front of him for a moment, not at Burke, at the mat, as if the mat itself had provided information he was still processing. Then he looked at Mildred Burke. She looked back at him. He rose to his knees. He placed both hands on his thighs. He bowed forward, low, the full formal bow of a student to a teacher, not the quick nod of acknowledgement that passes for a bow in a training room, a full bow, held for 3 seconds. When he came back up, he said 7 words. "You are stronger than most men I've fought." Mildred Burke looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Come back Thursday. We are not finished." Bruce Lee said, "Yes." He stood. He collected his jacket from the edge of the mat. He walked to the door. He put his shoes on. He bowed again at the door, the same bow he had given at the entrance, the automatic gesture of someone for whom respect is not a response to specific conditions, but a practice that does not switch off. He walked to his car. He sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine. He opened his notebook. He wrote for 11 minutes. Ray, who had followed to lock the building door, saw Bruce Lee sitting in the car through the window. He saw him writing. He did not interrupt. He later said, "I don't know what he wrote, but I have never seen a man who just lost something look that focused. He didn't look like a man who had lost. He looked like a man who had just found something he had been looking for." Bruce Lee sat in his car outside Mildred Burke's gym in Encino for 11 minutes on the morning of September 16th, 1969. His notebook was open on the steering wheel. The handwriting in this section, documented by Linda Lee after his death and referenced in several accounts of his training philosophy, is smaller than his usual entries, more compressed, the way a person writes when they are trying to fit a large thought into a small space before it escapes. The entry, reconstructed from Linda Lee's accounts and the documented training philosophies of this period, captures two ideas. The first, she did not beat me with strength. She beat me with 34 years of one question asked correctly. The second, written beneath it, underlined twice, I have been asking the wrong question about the ground. He closed the notebook. He started the engine. He drove back to Bel Air. He did not tell Linda what had happened that morning. Not because he was ashamed, because he had not finished understanding it yet, and Bruce Lee did not speak about things he had not finished understanding. He believed, and said so in multiple training sessions documented by his students, that speaking about an unresolved problem before resolving it was a way of substituting the conversation for the solution. He went to the June Fan Institute at 628 College Street that afternoon and taught 4 classes. He came back Thursday. He arrived at 8:55 a.m., 5 minutes early. Ray noted this in the private account he shared with the wrestling historian in 1984. The first time he came, he arrived at exactly 9. The second time, 5 minutes early. I noticed because Mrs. Burke always said that how early a student arrives tells you more about their motivation than anything they say when they get there. Mildred Burke was on the mat again when Bruce arrived. Same position, same focused economy of movement, same absence of any acknowledgement that a world-famous martial artist had just walked into her gym. Bruce removed his shoes. He bowed at the door. He warmed up in the corner. This time, he watched her during the warm-up. Not her technique, her timing, the specific rhythm of her breathing during movement, the way her exhale corresponded to weight shifts, the way her inhale corresponded to position changes. Breathing is the one physical variable that cannot be fully concealed, and in a specialist who has drilled the same movements for 34 years, the breath and the movement have become synchronized so completely that the breath predicts the movement by approximately 0.2 seconds. Bruce Lee was looking for 0.2 seconds. The second session lasted longer than the first. They worked for 40 minutes. Burke pinned Bruce Lee 3 times. The fourth attempt, she moved to pin him, and he used the breath timing he had mapped during the warm-up to anticipate her weight shift by 0.15 seconds and create enough space to prevent the pin. Not to escape, not to reverse, to prevent. The difference between 0 inches of movement and 0.15 seconds of movement is enormous on the ground. Mildred Burke looked at him after the fourth attempt. She said, "You watched my breathing." He said, "Yes." She said, "Nobody has done that before." He said, "I believe it. It took me until the second session." She made a sound that Ray later described as the closest thing to a laugh I had heard from her in years. They worked for 20 more minutes after that. He came back the following Tuesday. Bruce Lee came to Mildred Burke's gym in Encino 5 times in September and October 1969. The results of those 5 sessions measured in pins. Session 1, Burke 1, Lee 0. Session 2, Burke 3, Lee 0 pins, 1 prevention. Session 3, Burke 2, Lee 0 pins, 3 preventions. Session 4, Burke 1, Lee 0 pins, 6 preventions. Session 5, Burke 1, Lee 0 pins, 9 preventions, 1 near escape. He never pinned her. Not once in 5 sessions. Not in the first session when he had his best prepared techniques. Not in the 5th session when he had mapped her breathing. identified her 3 primary base configurations, and developed specific counter-approaches for each. He came close. The near escape in session 5, Burke's own account, relayed to her student Denise 3 days after the final session, involved a movement she said she had not seen before from anyone, anywhere, in 34 years of wrestling. He found an angle in my right hip that I didn't know existed, she told Denise. I closed it, but I had to close it. Nobody had ever found it before. He never came back after the 5th session, not because he stopped learning, because he understood after 5 sessions that what Mildred Burke had built across 34 years was not a technique that could be absorbed in 5 sessions. It was a system, and the system was inseparable from the 34 years that had produced it. You cannot download 34 years, but you can learn what 34 years produces and build toward it differently. That is what he did. Dan Inosanto, Bruce Lee's student, his closest training partner, one of fewer the punty people who understood what Bruce was building between 1967 and 1973, taught a ground positioning drill throughout the early 1970s that none of his students could identify the origin of. The drill focused on one specific principle: base disruption through asymmetric hip weight transfer. The idea was this: a conventional base position distributes weight symmetrically, equal pressure on both contact points, equal stability on both sides. A correctly established base is structurally sound against symmetric force. Against asymmetric force, pressure applied at an angle that addresses one contact point more heavily than the other. The base produces a microshift. That microshift, if caught within 0.15 seconds, creates enough instability to initiate a reversal. The drill required a partner to hold a base position while the practitioner mapped it with light contact, 4 to 6 pounds of pressure at different angles, until the asymmetric vulnerability was identified. Then exploit it. Not with force, with timing, Inosanto later confirmed. In a 1994 seminar documented on audio recording, that Bruce Lee introduced this drill in late 1969 or early 1970. He said Bruce described it simply as something I learned from someone who knew the ground better than I did. He did not name Mildred Burke in that description. He did not need to. The drill named her. Every time a student of Bruce Lee's ran that drill, in Los Angeles, in Oakland, in the gyms and schools that spread Jeet Kune Do after Bruce's death in 1973, they were running a distillation of 5 sessions in Encino with a 53-year-old woman who had beaten 200 men. One of those men was Bruce Lee. Denise, the student who observed the first session from the edge of the mat, asked Burke about Bruce Lee the day after his 5th visit. She asked what he was like. Burke thought about the question for a moment. Then she said, "He is the most honest student I have ever taught. Most people who come here want to prove something. He came here to find something. Those are completely different students. The first kind leaves frustrated. The second kind leaves with something real." Denise asked if Burke thought Bruce Lee would have pinned her eventually, if he had kept coming. Burke said, "I don't know. Maybe he was finding things in my structure that I had to actively close. Nobody had done that since 1936. She paused. Then she said, "But I think he understood something more important than whether he could pin me. He understood that the question was not how do I beat this. The question was, what is this?" Most people never ask the second question. He was asking it by the second session. That is the account Denise gave in a 1988 interview with a California sports magazine. The same year Mildred Burke died. The interview was published in a regional publication with limited circulation. It was never referenced in any major Bruce Lee biography. It sat in an archive for 36 years. There is one detail from the first session that Ray described that nobody who has written about Bruce Lee has ever included in the record: the bow at the door. Not the bow at the end of the session, the bow that accompanied the 7 words, the bow that Denise and Ray both witnessed and both remembered. That bow is remarkable, but it is expected. A martial artist bowing after a match, even a loss, is conventional. The bow at the door was not conventional. It happened before the session, before any outcome was known, before any result had been produced, before Bruce Lee had any information about whether Mildred Burke would earn his respect or not. He bowed at the door because she had built something across 34 years that he had come specifically to encounter. The bow was not a response to the outcome. It was a response to the preparation to what she had built before he arrived, not to what she did while he was there. This is the distinction that the 7 words make visible. You are stronger than most men I've fought. He did not say, "You beat me." He said, "You are stronger." Strength, in Bruce Lee's vocabulary, was never primarily physical. It was structural. It was the product of accumulated understanding turned into automatic function. Mildred Burke was stronger than most men Bruce Lee had fought. Not because she could generate more force, she could not, but because she had built, across 34 years, a physical intelligence that most men he had faced had never bothered to develop. The bow was for that. The 7 words were for that. The loss was for that. Mildred Burke continued running her school in Encino through the 1970s. Among her students during this period was a Canadian wrestler who would go on to become the WWA champion, known later as Monster Ripper. Burke trained her. Burke trained others. She stayed on the mat until her health no longer permitted it. She died on February 18, 1989. She was 73 years old. She was inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame in 2016, 27 years after her death. The Hall of Fame citation noted her record against men. It noted her 20-year championship reign. It noted her role as a pioneer of women's wrestling in America. It did not mention the Tuesday morning in September 1969 when a 28-year-old martial artist drove to Encino and sat in her gym and spent 4 minutes learning something 34 years of preparation had built. It did not mention the 7 words. It did not mention the bow at the door. Some things do not fit in citations. They fit in the specific detail of what was passed forward in a ground positioning drill that Dan Inosanto taught in the early 1970s, and never fully explained in a notebook entry with 2 underlined sentences, in the way Bruce Lee's students learned to read a base position using asymmetric pressure rather than direct force, without knowing exactly where that understanding came from. It came from Encino. It came from a woman who had already beaten 199 men before Bruce Lee knocked on her door, and who beat one more when he arrived. Bruce Lee's most documented principle, written in notebooks, said in interviews, taught in sessions, repeated by every student who spent serious time with him, is this: absorb what is useful, discard what is not, add what is uniquely your own. Most people read that as a principle about winning, about taking the best from every system and becoming unbeatable. It is not about winning. It is about the willingness to be in a position where you encounter something you cannot handle, and to choose, in that position, to absorb rather than resist. Resisting produces nothing. Absorbing produces the drill that Dan Inosanto taught for 30 years without knowing exactly what it was named after. Bruce Lee lost on a mat in Encino in September 1969. He lost to a 53-year-old woman who weighed 138 pounds and had spent 34 years building something that his 14 years of preparation had not yet produced. He bowed. He said 7 words. He sat in his car for 11 minutes and wrote 2 sentences. He came back Thursday. He never pinned her. He absorbed everything she had to teach. And the most dangerous thing about Bruce Lee, the thing that made him genuinely extraordinary, rather than simply fast or strong or skilled, was not that he could not be beaten. It was that when he was beaten, he bowed. Before this video ends, one question, and we read every answer in the comments. The thing that is currently beating you, are you resisting it, or are you absorbing it? Leave your answer below. We read every one,